The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet town of Westfield, Massachusetts. Inside a modest home on a sleepy street, the rhythmic sound of scissors snipping filled the air. The scent of shaving cream and warm towels lingered as young Philip A. Payton, Jr. swept the wooden floor of his father's barber shop. "Steady hands, son. Presentation is everything," his father, Philip Sr., often said while shaping a customer's hairline with precision. Philip had spent his entire childhood in this shop, watching his father work tirelessly to provide for their family. But he knew, deep in his heart, he was meant for something more. The barber shop was a place of lively conversation, a meeting ground for men who spoke of their ambitions and struggles. Philip listened intently as customers talked about business, money, and dreams of a better life. Some whispered about opportunities in the big city, New York, where fortunes were made and lost every day. The idea of leaving everything behind and heading into the unknown both thrilled and terrified him. Could a young black man from a small town really make something of himself in a city where the odds were stacked against him? One evening, as the last customer left and his father counted the day's earnings, Philip gathered the courage to speak. "Papa, I don't want to cut hair my whole life," he admitted, his voice steady but resolute. "I want to build something. I want to make a difference." His father looked up, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then, to Philip's surprise, he nodded. "Then you must go and see what you're made of," his father said. "New York will test you, but if you've got fire in your soul, nothing can put it out." That night, Philip could barely sleep. The path ahead was uncertain, but the decision was made. At dawn, with nothing but a small bag of belongings and a mind full of dreams, Philip boarded a train to New York City. He had no idea what awaited him. The train screeched into Grand Central Station, a monstrous cathedral of steel and glass, pulsating with life. The moment Philip A. Payton, Jr. stepped off, he felt it, the sheer, overwhelming energy of New York City. The streets hummed with urgency, carriages clattered over cobblestone roads, and vendors shouted their wares from every corner. It was a city of motion, of ambition, and of brutal indifference. Philip tightened his grip on his worn leather bag. He had no job, no contacts, and barely enough money to survive more than a few days. But he had one thing no one could take from him: his determination. He found a cheap boarding house in Harlem, paying for a week up front. The room was barely big enough for a cot and a small desk, but it didn't matter. He was in New York now. The first weeks were punishing. He tried his luck at various jobs, loading cargo at the docks, shining shoes on Wall Street, even selling newspapers on street corners. But none of them lasted. One day, after yet another rejection, he found himself staring at his reflection in a shop window. The man looking back at him was thinner, his clothes slightly more tattered than before. New York was swallowing him whole. Desperate for work, he took up barbering again, cutting hair in a small shop run by an old acquaintance from Westfield. It wasn't the dream, but it paid for food and a place to sleep. Yet, every night, as he walked back to his room, he saw something that unsettled him. Black families being pushed out of their homes, their belongings piled on sidewalks, their landlords turning them away. "Can't rent to your kind anymore," he overheard a white landlord say to a struggling black mother, her children clutching onto her coat. Something burned inside Philip. The city had rejected him at every turn, and now it was rejecting his people. But why? What gave these landlords the power to dictate who could live where? Then and there, he made a vow. He would find a way to fight back. One afternoon, as he finished cutting a customer's hair, he heard two men arguing in the shop. "I'll not rent to those folks again. No good comes of it," one landlord spat. "I'd rather burn my buildings to the ground before I let them move in," the other agreed. Philip's jaw clenched. It was the same story everywhere. White landlords shutting their doors to black tenants, forcing them into overcrowded, overpriced slums. But then, something unexpected happened. The two men turned to an older gentleman sitting in the corner, smoking his cigar. "What do you think, Mr. Cooper?" The man smirked. "You boys are fools," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "You're too busy trying to keep them out that you don't see the money to be made. Mark my words, Harlem's changing." Philip's heart pounded. Someone saw what he saw. That night, he couldn't shake the thought. If white landlords didn't want to rent to black families, what if a black man became a landlord himself? The dream was planted. But how does a broke barber become a real estate mogul? Philip A. Payton, Jr. had no money, no connections, and no real estate experience. But he had one advantage. He understood struggle. He knew what it meant to be rejected, to be turned away, to be told he wasn't good enough. That fire in his gut was enough to fuel him forward. He started small. Between cutting hair and running errands, he hung around real estate offices, listening, watching, absorbing. He learned the language of landlords, the whispers of deals being made over cigars and brandy. He paid attention to which properties changed hands, who was buying, and most importantly, who was struggling. One day, fate cracked the door open. While sweeping the barber shop floor, he overheard a landlord complaining about a troublesome building he owned on West 134th Street. "Place is a headache," the man groaned. "Tenants can't pay. Repairs are endless. Thinking of cutting my losses." Philip's ears perked up. He had no money to buy a building, but what if he could manage it? He waited for the right moment, then approached the man outside the shop. "Sir, I couldn't help but hear you're looking for someone to handle your building," Philip said carefully. The landlord looked him up and down, scoffing. "You? What do you know about managing property?" Philip straightened his shoulders. "Enough to know those apartments don't need to sit empty. I can find tenants, reliable ones. You won't have to lift a finger." The landlord narrowed his eyes. "And what's in it for you?" "Just a small commission," Philip answered. "You get your rent, I get my share. No risk to you." The man considered it, chewing on his cigar. He was desperate, and desperate men took chances. "Fine," he grumbled. "You've got a month to prove you can turn it around." Philip had just secured his first real estate deal. Philip wasted no time. He spread the word in Harlem's black community. There were apartments available, and they were for them. He personally vetted tenants, ensuring they paid rent on time. He fixed minor repairs himself to save money. Soon the building was full, and the landlord, now getting his rent consistently, was impressed. He gave Philip more properties to manage. Then came the moment Philip had been waiting for. One day, another landlord, one who had openly refused to rent to black tenants, found himself in financial trouble. His property was losing money, and he needed to sell. Philip saw the opportunity and took the boldest step yet. Instead of just managing properties, he bought one. With every penny he had, plus a loan from a black investor who believed in his vision, Philip became a property owner. It was a historic shift. He was no longer just a middleman. He was a landlord. And he had one rule. His buildings would be homes for black families, no matter what. But the white real estate tycoons were watching, and they weren't happy. Philip had cracked the door open. Now, the battle was about to begin. Philip A. Payton, Jr. had done the unthinkable. A black man, once just a barber struggling to survive, was now a landlord in New York City. And not just any landlord, one who was giving black families a chance to live with dignity in Harlem. For a brief moment, things looked promising. His buildings were filling up. Rent was flowing in. His dream was becoming real. But then, the city pushed back. Harlem's white landlords were furious. They had spent years keeping black tenants confined to overpriced, run-down apartments in slum conditions. And now, here was Philip, offering fair housing, proving that black families could afford quality homes, and disrupting the entire power structure. The retaliation was swift. Landlords refused to sell to him. Property owners pressured banks to deny him loans. Advertisements for his apartments were mysteriously removed from newspapers. Then came the real blow. One morning, Philip received a letter. The Hudson Realty Company, a powerful white-owned firm, had bought out several of his properties. Their first move? Evict every black tenant. It was a message. Get out of Harlem. This is not your place. Philip stood on the sidewalk, watching as families he had fought to house were forced out onto the street. Children clung to their mothers. Fathers carried what little they could. Rage burned in his chest. They wanted him to quit. They wanted him to back down. But Philip wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. This wasn't just real estate. This was war. Philip didn't waste time mourning. He went on the offensive. With the help of black investors who believed in his mission, he formed the Afro-American Realty Company in 1904. His goal? Buy as much property in Harlem as possible and make it a home for black families, permanently. He issued 50,000 shares at $10 each, reaching out to black business owners, church leaders, and everyday people who wanted to invest in their own community. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. And then he made his boldest move yet. He struck back at Hudson Realty. If they wanted to buy out his properties and evict black families, he would buy out theirs. Building by building, block by block, Philip flipped the script. He bought properties next to Hudson Realty's buildings, evicted the white tenants, and replaced them with black residents. The white landlords panicked. They had started a war to drive him out, but now they were the ones losing ground. Newspapers called it the real estate race war, and Philip was winning. His name spread. He was no longer just Philip Payton. He was the father of Harlem. His buildings stood as proof that black families deserved more than slums, that they could live in dignity, that segregation didn't have to be the law of the land. But as his empire grew, so did the pressure. Enemies were everywhere. Lawsuits started piling up. Banks that once loaned him money now turned their backs. Investors got nervous, and soon cracks began to form. Philip A. Payton Jr. stood in his Harlem office, staring at the stacks of legal papers before him. The room was dimly lit, the heavy scent of cigar smoke lingering in the air. Outside, the streets bustled with families moving into homes he had fought to secure. Yet, inside these four walls, his empire was under siege. For years, he had defied the odds, outmaneuvering racist landlords, building an empire where black families could thrive. But now, the pressure was relentless. Lawsuits, debt, betrayal. The same investors who had once believed in his mission were now suing him. The economic downturn of 1907 had sent shockwaves through New York, tightening bank loans and leaving even the wealthiest investors scrambling to save their fortunes. Afro-American Realty Company, his life's work, was drowning. White-owned banks, already wary of financing a black-run real estate company, cut him off completely. Newspapers that had once praised him now ran articles questioning his finances. Was Payton's vision too big? One headline sneered. Some investors turned against him, claiming he had misrepresented his assets. Landlords who had once seen him as a nuisance now saw their chance to reclaim Harlem. One by one, they began buying back properties that had once been under his control. Philip fought. He met with investors, trying to assure them Harlem was still the future. He negotiated with banks, pleading for more time. He even sold off some of his own properties to keep the company afloat. But the walls were closing in. By 1908, Afro-American Realty Company collapsed. Everything he had built, the buildings, the the shares, the dream, was slipping away. Most men would have disappeared. Most men would have accepted defeat. Not Philip Payton. While others counted him out, he refused to leave Harlem. Instead of walking away, he started over. He founded the Philip A. Payton Jr. Company, this time focusing on smaller, strategic real estate deals. No flashy investments, no outside shareholders, just him, his experience, and his relentless will. Slowly, he rebuilt. He acquired new properties, this time avoiding the over-reliance on risky investors. He focused on long-term stability instead of rapid expansion. Most importantly, he never abandoned his mission. Every building he owned remained a home for black families. By 1914, Harlem was no longer a battleground. It was a thriving black community. And it was because of him. But fate had one final test waiting for him. By 1914, Harlem was no longer just a collection of buildings. It was a movement, a neighborhood transformed, a place where black families could live, work, and dream without fear of being pushed out. And at the heart of it all was Philip A. Payton Jr. His name was spoken with admiration in Harlem's churches, barbershops, and gathering halls. He had done what no one thought possible. He had carved out a home for his people in a city that wanted them gone. But life had a cruel way of cutting brilliance short. In 1917, at just 41 years old, Philip fell ill. The man who had fought landlords, lawsuits, and racism could not fight death. On August 29, 1917, Philip A. Payton Jr. passed away. The news sent shockwaves through Harlem. People mourned not just a businessman, but a warrior, a pioneer, a man who had given everything to build something greater than himself. White landlords and real estate moguls celebrated his passing, thinking his vision would die with him. But they were wrong. Philip had not just built buildings, he had built a foundation. By the 1920s, Harlem had become the epicenter of black culture in America. The Harlem Renaissance brought poets, musicians, and intellectuals into the very buildings he had fought to create. Jazz echoed through the streets. Black businesses flourished. Harlem was no longer a place of eviction and exclusion. It was a place of pride, power, and permanence. Philip had won. Today, history remembers him as the father of Harlem, the man who defied racism, rejection, and financial ruin to create a home for generations of black families.